So this is Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Fours, Sutta number 162. Bhikkhus, there are four kinds of practice. What four? Unpleasant practice with low insight, unpleasant practice with swift insight, pleasant practice with slow insight, and pleasant practice with swift insight. And what's the unpleasant practice with slow insight? It's when someone is by nature acutely given to passion and often experiences the pain and displeasure born of passion. They're by nature acutely given to aversion and often experience the pain and displeasure born of aversion. They're by nature acutely given to muddledness, often translated as delusion, and often experience the pain and displeasure born of muddledness. These five faculties manifest in them weakly: faith, effort, recollection, composure, and understanding. Because of this, they only slowly come into proximity of the destruction of the influxes. This is called the unpleasant practice with slow insight. And what's the unpleasant practice with swift insight? So it's the same in terms of being predisposed to defilements more strongly, but then the five faculties manifest in them strongly. Because of this, they swiftly come into proximity of the destruction of the influxes. This is called the unpleasant practice with swift insight. And so what's the pleasant practice with slow insight? It's when someone is by nature not acutely given to passion and doesn't often experience the pain and displeasure born of passion. They're by nature not acutely given to aversion and don't often experience the pain and displeasure born of aversion. They're by nature not acutely given to muddledness and don't often experience the pain and displeasure born of muddledness. But the five faculties manifest in them weakly, and because of that they only slowly come into proximity of the destruction of the influxes. And then the pleasant practice with swift insight is when someone isn't by nature acutely given to the defilements, and they do have the strong faculties as well. So because of that, they swiftly come into proximity of the destruction of the influxes. So these are the four kinds of practice. So we can start with a simple question. Is it a matter of choice whether your practice is pleasant or not? Because you often hear this idea that, especially when we talk about enduring pain on the mental level, on the right endurance and not giving into unwholesome states, and that often there's a certain displeasure associated with that because you're preventing the mind from having things that it wants. And so there's often this idea that unpleasant practices need to be balanced out with pleasant practices from time to time, because otherwise it's going to be too much. Which kind of implies that, yes, pleasant and unpleasant practice is a matter of choice. It's like based on the method that you do or something like that. So we can clearly see that that's not.
Yeah, it isn't a matter of choice, the degree to which you've been acting out of greed, aversion, delusion, up until the point at which you find yourself.
Yeah, because...
what the baseline is.
Exactly, because that's what's going to determine whether it's pleasant or not. It's like, if you have a dog that's very used to just doing whatever it wants, and then you go for a walk with it, trying to make it go where you want it to go, it's not going to be pleasant because it's going to be trying to go everywhere else except where you want it to go, and it's going to be very strong, and that's not going to be a pleasant walk. So that's as simple as it gets. So
whereas if you have a dog that is not, is used to being tame and is used to being well trained, when you go for a walk, it'll be very easy.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why, well, actually, the word sukha and dukkha often is translated as pleasure and displeasure. But another accurate translation for it would be easy and difficult. So you could say it's easy practice with slow or fast results, or difficult practice slow or fast results.
Yes, but then it is important to still keep in mind that what is your choice is whether you practice or not.
Exactly, yeah.
And what the practice is.
And that that what the practice is isn't a matter of choice. Like taming the animal isn't a matter of choice. But what people would think is that like putting a pause on their taming of the animal and doing something completely different is also practice. And that's a pleasant practice.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you have a say.
Yeah, but what's really happening there is at that moment you're not practicing. When like if you stop feeling the tension of the dog that's not tamed, it's because you're not holding the leash anymore.
Well, or worse, the dog might be taking you for
Oh
a
yeah,
walk.
exactly. Yeah, one of those two.
Yeah.
So, of course, it's for most people today definitely because of the starting point of being used to a lot of pleasures and dependencies and attachments. It is going to be difficult. So it doesn't mean that you need to do it all at once. That you need to go from full indulgence to just being completely secluded, isolated from everything, and utmost asceticism.
Yeah, just restrain everything basically.
Yeah. You can do it gradually. So even if it takes you 5, 10 years, 15 years, at least you're doing the practice, and you're not cheating yourself into thinking that by not doing the practice and just distracting myself with whatever pleasures of oblivion, that's somehow contributing to the taming of the mind. So another thing is, how would you know if your mind is which kind of predisposition you have? Is it something that would be obvious to you, or is it something that needs more kind of acute discernment to see?
Well, with these 5 faculties, you basically wouldn't really know until you got the right view.
Right, of course. But when it comes to the passion, aversion, and idleness, if you're, how would you know if you're acutely predisposed to those defilements or not?
Well, take the 8 precepts seriously, for example, and you'll find out. And if that idea of taking the 8 precepts seriously, if on the level of ideas of those 8 precepts,
you already have
objections. You are already challenged and begin to say, this can't be right, or well, this is only for monks, or right. You notice excuses coming up there. Well, then you're not on the route of the pleasant practice, basically.
Yeah. Because when you read that, it can often sound like, strong passion, strong aversion. So it brings up this image of like this ravenous kind of crazy lust or something that somebody might have. But you have to realize that from your perspective, all your defilements always feel normal because that's what you live with.
Yes.
So you will never be able to like, maybe if you've met other people and then through conversation you realize that for them it's easy and for you it's not or something. But if all you have is your own point of view, it's always going to feel normal. You're only going to start realizing how strong it is, as you said, when you start putting limits on what the mind is allowed to do, when you start taking the precepts, for example.
Yeah, and also a notion like normal is slippery ground to begin with. So you cannot take that as a standard.
Yeah.
So that feeds into the whole discussion of authenticity. Doing something, for example, because everybody else is doing it, or because it's accepted in society, and so on. If that becomes the standard, you can already forget understanding a Dhamma that has as its main characteristic that it goes against the grain.
Yeah, and one of those things about normality, quote unquote, is, as we mentioned before, the distinction between like practice for monks and practice for lay people. Which you might think like it's normal for lay people to have some amount of lust because they're lay people. But the thing is, if you see the Dhamma as the practice that's meant to lead to your own welfare, and you see craving as against your own welfare, then like you wouldn't be saying like, oh yeah, it's normal for me to have this amount of cancer.
Mm. Yeah.
And even lay disciples in the suttas, they would come to the Buddha and they would tell him, I'm worried because despite being a layperson, because it doesn't matter fundamentally, despite being a layperson, I see that my mind is frequently coming up with these unwholesome states, and I know that shouldn't happen. And so they had that sense of shame and sense of this is wrong, which is one of the faculties of a noble disciple, even though they were lay people. So that's that authenticity factor, and taking responsibility for your own mind and realizing that it's the training is not, you're not doing it because the external code of being a monk sort of forces you to take it to this extent. You're taking it to the full extent because why would you want to suffer?
Yes.
So yeah, and practically speaking, given that the starting point for most of us nowadays is very much in the opposite direction of renunciation. Like, how often do you find someone who just by nature keeps the precepts? Even Buddhists, for that matter. Somebody who, they're not being forced, they're not monks, they just took on the 8 precepts and they find it easy, and it's not trouble for them at all.
Or just to have, or even one step back, to just, even if they sometimes slip up, to still see that it is worthwhile re-establishing themselves and keeping that as a value.
Yeah.
With all the books on Buddhism that have been published since, let's say, the late 1960s, we're talking about thousands of books that have flooded the West. How many books even make that point?
Yeah.
Well, I can say, unfortunately, I've read hundreds of them, but no, it's just, at best, it's optional. So from that point of view, the introduction of Buddhism in the West has been somewhat of a disaster.
Yeah, and you can tell also that, as we were saying before, it's your mind may not necessarily have, strong like as I said before, lust of like, oh, I just can't help, I just need this. It might just be very simple excuses that it comes up with, and to kind of like make you stop sooner, and if you don't stop, you will realize, as it goes on, that it is actually intensifying, and it is really just an irrational, pure passion.
Stop keeping the precepts.
Yeah. So the mind is trying to convince you to stop keeping the precepts. So if you don't listen to those like superficial excuses, and you actually stay with it, over time you will realize, no, actually it is just pure craving, pure passion, pure desire that the mind, like, that's why it's kind of like pre-rational. And so because the mind wants to avoid the pain, it comes up with these excuses. But because you don't see your own mind, you might then trust that, oh yeah, it's, I'm doing it because I'm a lay person, or because of this, or because of that. But really, the true reason, you're not admitting it to yourself.
And I think like it's exactly what the sutta is pointing to, is like, despite the fact that you keep the precept, your sense restraint and so on, like the pleasure or the pain is not for you a guideline to follow. How do you feel is not what is your, is not a criteria to follow, basically. And also like how fast is the result is also not a criteria to follow. It's just keep doing it, basically.
And also, do you see that you are restraining greed, aversion, and delusion? Because there are often times where, when you have these whole Dhutanga practices, and that people can become very inspired by, and that would be generally regarded as like, unpleasant practice or something. But the thing is, you would just adopt these external observances. You're not clear about how is it that this actually influences your greed, aversion, and delusion. You're not even aware of that you may be doing those practices with greed, aversion, and delusion on a different level, of course, than just the pure sensuality. So it's neither how you feel, nor how quick it is, nor any of this. It's direct seeing of defilements and absence of defilements. And that's why that sutta that we discussed the other in one of the previous talks, where the Buddha said the standard that you should go by is not the tradition, is not authority, is not even your own reasoning and logic. It's what is affected with greed, or what is rooted in non-greed. What is passion? What is aversion? What is non-aversion? That should be your criteria for what is beneficial and not beneficial. Because, and there are plenty of suttas where the Buddha says,
It's the Kalama Sutta.
Yeah. There are plenty of suttas where the Buddha says what the majority regards as pleasant, the noble ones regard as unpleasant. Yeah. When the noble ones regard as unpleasant, the majority regards as pleasant. So that's how it's going to be. Like the same practice, the same giving up, which is, by the way, where the joy comes from in the suttas. It's always like the joy of renunciation, the joy of non-sensuality.
Yeah, because that's the thing. There's this other sutta which also talks about pleasant and unpleasant practice, and then it says pleasurable practice. It describes the four jhanas, and then unpleasant practice has to do with these perceptions that a noble disciple can contemplate, like
mindfulness of death, perception of impermanence, non-attractiveness, non-delight in the whole world.
Well, exactly, repulsiveness of food, and so on. So, but then the pleasant practice being the jhana, that is again not the result of some technique that you have received, but rather fully the result of virtue and restraint.
Yeah, because there's one discourse where the Buddha, before his enlightenment, he asked himself, essentially, why is it that even though I see the benefit of renunciation, my practice isn't pleasant? That's one way you could paraphrase what he said. Like, why is it that the mind doesn't leap at renunciation? It doesn't feel confident. It doesn't feel kind of relieved by it. And he realized, it's because I haven't sufficiently seen the danger in sensuality. And then once that he saw that sufficiently, then the joy arose, and he basically entered the first jhana. Because it's that same giving up that for you is unpleasant initially, that, like, just imagine, is it, if something that you really want gets taken away from you, that's obviously unpleasant. But if something that you saw was harmful, was like a dart, like an arrow that was deeply digging into your leg or something, and then it gets taken away, would you be sad because it was taken away? No. You would be, that would be the right type of joy. So it's, and always in the suttas, the joy is described as the joy of having abandoned unwholesome states. It's not just the joy of thinking nice thoughts or something. Now, of course, pleasant feelings will arise sometimes, whether you like it or not. So we're not saying that you need to like destroy every pleasant feeling that arises. But the Buddha made this distinction between pleasure that should be cultivated, and pleasure that shouldn't be cultivated, even if it arises.
Yeah, so there's the pleasure bound up with sensuality, and there is the pleasure of renunciation. So both are a pleasure, but they are in opposite directions.
Yeah, and like we said, like the pleasure of sensuality, for as long as you have five senses, it will be there. You will not be seeking it, but some extent of it will be there, even just because you have to eat every day. But you realize, as the Buddha said, that pleasure is dangerous, should not be like intentionally sought after and made much of. So that's the point. You will have pleasant feelings of the wrong kind, whether you like it or not. But what the pleasant feelings that should be practiced and should be made a vehicle are the pleasant feelings that would arise in regard to the same thing that for you right now might be very painful and unpleasant.
Yeah, and this is why faith is also the first of these faculties that it mentioned in this discourse. And that's precisely this point. So what you regard as pleasurable now is actually painful. So you need to go through the renunciation in order to gain, let's say, the wholesome pleasure. But without having faith that such a wholesome pleasure is possible, you will never give up the other one because it's the only one you know from the starting point.
So then that lack of faith precisely actually would be the same thing that would make you impatient and would make you want to get the pleasure that you can get now, because you don't want to actually like fix the illness, which requires taking this medicine that might be quite bitter. You want to just stop feeling the pain of the treatment at all costs, and then you take another medicine that kind of removes the side effects of this good medicine, but also removes the actual good effect as well. So then it cancels it out, and that's really what that joyful practice, quote unquote, that people would think is a matter of choice or matter of some technique that you do or something. That's what it's really doing. It's canceling the practice.
It's quite a funny thing, because if it was a matter of choice, I could not imagine the Buddha like mentioning anything else than a fast and a pleasant practice.
Encouraging,
it would be, your practice should be fast and quick, abandon everything else. But it's not what he said.
Exactly. And you have multiple. I mean, quite explicitly, it says, because this nibbana cannot be attained without great perseverance, effort, diligence, endurance, patience. That you have so many verses saying that, and from many monks and from the Buddha himself. So if it were a matter of just something easy that from the very start is just going to be sweet and like it's precisely because that direction of nibbana is against the grain, as we said. That's why beings are naturally by going the opposite direction. If the Dhamma, if renunciation, if giving up, if nibbana, if non-identification were pleasant, everyone would naturally be.
They would have it by now already.
And they would be inclining towards nibbana whether they hear the Dhamma or not. Everyone would be like a Pachika Buddha or something eventually. But it's not. So, as the Buddha said, if beings don't hear the Dhamma, the majority of them, they just
they go
sink
down.
Because that's what feels natural. That's what feels easy from where you stand.
Yeah, and also regarding what you say like a bit earlier about the Dhutanga practice, like that's way more easy to assume that doing these certain things, like whatever it is, like, I don't know, going naked in the forest or whatever you want to do, that's way more easy than to sit in your room alone and not knowing what you're supposed to do. Like this kind of doubt is way more unpleasant to bear, and that requires the patience and endurance that you were mentioning before, where like assuming that I already know the practice, that is just going in the forest naked, that doesn't require any patience and endurance because you assume you already know. So it's not...
You're in control.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's that safety of having something that I can just stick to, and then magically the results will come. And
it's exactly the same as any sensual like craving, basically. Because it's exactly the same attitude. Like when I want to smoke a cigarette, it's because I believe that this cigarette will fix my problem
later.
It's the same thing.
Is, as the Buddha said, you're seeking after what requires time. Like when he said the principle of sensuality is seeking after things that require time.
Yes, whereas
the Dhamma is always timeless.
Yeah, so to not give in to pressure is immediate.
Yeah.
Whereas to follow your desires always involves some effort. But in the beginning, it will not look like that.
Yeah,
But that's not the difficulty.
But I meant even here, of course, you have the crude sensuality and stuff. But even with this, it's actually the same principle.
With Dutangas.
Yeah. Like
Ah.
just the blind hope that I just do this, and sometime later, something will happen.
Yes.
You're not seeing the pressure now.
And by the way, we talk about Dutanga like as kind of crazy practice, but just like sitting alone in front of a wall and following your breathing for an hour.
Focusing techniques.
Yeah, that's
same
actually this is the same principle there.
It's
Exactly.
Aditana, don't move for an hour. Don't move
Yeah.
for 3 hours.
Yeah, even if your leg hurts, don't.
Don't move at all. That's the
move,
same
yeah.
things.
Yeah, so that is easier than the uncertainty of having to clarify your views. As you said, recognize what is actually wholesome. Like, am I actually clear about that? So that in itself is one of the most unpleasant elements of the practice. It's not just because sure, there's the addiction to sensuality, there's that, but even once you overcome that,
There's still that doubt.
you still have doubt about the practice, what you should do, the mind trying to find any avenue it can to kind of like push you astray and distract yourself from what actually matters. So yeah, it's until you, not on your own terms, on terms of you having actually tamed the mind, you overcome the 5 hindrances, which include doubt. Practice has to be going against grain, has to be unpleasant.
To begin with.
Yeah.
Because it could then turn out that you find yourself in a situation where it's not unpleasant, and then you don't also have to then go out of your way to get anxious about the fact that it's not unpleasant.
Yeah.
Can we say that the unpleasantness is in regard to the fact that I decide to stop regarding my feeling as a criteria to live my life, and that stopping to like relate to my feeling in that way is what is unpleasant? Can we say that?
So you're saying the thing that's unpleasant is that you no longer take feelings as a criterion for your actions.
Yeah, exactly. Is it what can be regarded as unpleasant?
Broadly speaking, yeah, because that would encompass more than just the obvious giving up of like, sure, you start keeping the precepts, but are you actually no longer taking feelings as a criteria? Because many people keep the precepts just out of many wrong views and doing many wrong practices on top of it that are still fundamentally based on making themselves feel better as soon as possible, overlooking what is actually greed, aversion, and delusion. Am I acting out of it? Have I actually understood that? Or, yeah, am I still assuming that what is wholesome is what feels good? So yeah, fundamentally, realizing that you can no longer rely on your feelings as a guideline, that would be like an unpleasant recognition to begin with. And keeping that in mind would sort of filter out a lot of the wrong avenues that you might go into. But then you want to also not you also want to actually do that, like not take feelings as a criteria, because a lot of people that can then go in the opposite direction and say, I have to always be feeling pain and torment and suffering,
Which is again, ironically, taking feeling as a measure.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how you would drift from the middle way. You're too far into indulgence, so you just kick back to the complete opposite, and that's pretty much the same thing. Like, you're still being driven by the impulses of your mind, it's not you controlling your mind.
And you're not teaching the mind anything, because you're not allowing, like, the animal to learn when it's making a mistake. If you're punishing it without it making a mistake first, it has to make the mistake in order for it to learn what the mistake is.
Yeah,
if you're just saying
existing is wrong, or something.
yeah, you should be feeling pain now, even though it's just innocently just breathing or sitting there or doing something which isn't mistaken.
Yeah.
You're not teaching it anything. It has to make a mistake, and then you punish it.
Yeah, so that's going back to what we said. You're not really thinking in terms of what is wholesome and wholesome.
You're not teaching your mind. You're not developing understanding.
Yeah. So that's why like discernment fundamentally boils down to that. It's not I think we've mentioned that before. It's not these mystical perceptions of emptiness or something. It's, do you actually know what is wholesome and unwholesome? Can you know for sure that the intentions that you're cultivating now lead to nibbana or away from it?
Yeah.
And that had to be your criteria for the practice. And then you will get to see down the line that in line with the Four Noble Truths and everything, the only reason why you were finding restraint, renunciation, giving up unpleasant, it wasn't by accident, actually. You were responsible even for that pain, because craving is the root of suffering, and craving is always, if there is suffering, there has to be craving presently at the same time. So it's not really even because of like the past things that you did, but you could say the past things that you did have increased your ignorance, because of which you don't see craving, and because of which you suffer now.
No.
But if you were to recognize, actually, you were to actually make that distinction with discernment, like picking things apart and seeing, actually, unpleasant feeling is one thing, craving is another, then there would be no ground for suffering. So,
regardless of what has happened in the past.
Exactly. So
the past is responsible for the intensity of the feelings that you now are either craving for or against. That is still the result of karma, which is let's say the results in time.
Yeah.
But now the situation that you are confronted with, either you understand craving is the origin of suffering or not, and that has nothing to do with the intensity of the experience.
Exactly.
The discernment encompasses all of that.
Yeah. So it's said in that way because obviously, like, ultimately, it's that timeless principle. Abandoning craving leads to abandoning suffering immediately, but you won't start out seeing craving. So what will happen is you will have these intense feelings coming up throughout your practice, and it will be unpleasant because you don't see craving. But it is through that practice that you are removing the obstacles for seeing craving.
As the origin of suffering. Yeah.